Okay, the meeting is now recording. So we'll start off with just a bit of background about you, David, get to know you a bit better. So tell us a bit about your background and what you do today at Amazon.
Sure. Well, my background, I grew up in the backwoods of Hernando County outside of Brooksville, Florida. If you've been on the West Coast, you might have at least driven by Brooksville on the way down to
My
Tampa.
camera on now?
Yep, you're on. Much better. I actually don't post this on LinkedIn because I want to get job offers, but it's much more than 20 years at this point. I graduated from UF in '87, and to give you an idea of how long ago that was, the CISE building and Martian Science Library didn't exist. Those were built about halfway through my time here, and they were a welcome addition. Because prior to that, the department was housed in Weil Hall, and we had classes in places like the auditorium and the journalism building. So I made it through all of that and ended up getting jobs in the field. Right now, I work at Amazon. I've been here for 6 years combined. I've been here for, this is actually my second time at Amazon. The first time was a disaster. I joined in December of 2012 and was on a very toxic team in a very toxic organization and ended up leaving the company, which is a story in itself. I left after about 7 months. I had a conversation with my manager and basically told me that the company would rather have people leave than be allowed to do what I was asking him to do. So I told him I could make that happen for him, and I did. In 2015, I had a manager, actually about 6 months after I left. So starting towards the end of 2013 and on, I would get occasional contacts from recruiters at Amazon saying, "Hey, I see you worked here before. We'd love to see about getting you back." And none of it ever worked out until 2015. This one guy convinced me to rejoin, and I'm really glad I did. So right now I work on a team that is, we own a bunch of internal services for authorization of abilities. So there's lots of individual services at Amazon and teams that run them more or less independently, but they depend on each other. So we give people the capability of saying, here's a thing that I care about granting access to. Here's the rules for what you need to do to get access to it. So we give teams tools to define those things. And then we also run a service that answers the question, is thing A allowed to do thing B to thing C? And we answer that question thousands of times a second. So that's the bulk of what we do. Amazon, of course, is huge. I've worked on 4 different teams now, including the one that I left in a hurry. I worked in what we called infrastructure, so another internal team where we were in charge of letting people figure out how much compute capacity they needed to run their services. And we would take their orders, get them ready for them, figure out how well they were actually using them, and give them a bunch of tools around that. And then most recently, prior to my current assignment, I was working in the Alexa organization, building services for the Echo device, which I have about a dozen in my home now, thanks to that. And they're extremely handy, but I'm very glad not to be working in that group anymore.
What services did you build for Alexa? I'm just curious to learn more about that.
Alexa, if you have an Echo, there's a feature called follow-up mode. The team that I was on was the primary owner of that. So you set a setting in the settings app, and then you can ask Alexa for the weather and then ask her a follow-up question without having to say her name. So if you have follow-up mode on, she'll listen for a few seconds after the most recent answer. So you can have a whole conversation just stringing things together. Some of the examples that we use are, you can ask the weather in a city, and you can ask about travel times to the airport and stuff like that. So you can link things together in a more natural way.
That's really cool. And yeah, that's one of the things that I like about Alexa. I've noticed when I use it at my home is you can ask those kind of chained questions. That's really cool. So we've actually already got a couple of questions in here. I'll put these on the screen here.
Okay.
The top one so far is, what's your favorite personal project? And for that matter, what do you think of personal projects?
I love personal projects. I think you should do as many of them as you can stomach. I also don't think that you need to be sitting in front of a computer 24 hours a day or all your waking hours in order to have a good experience, be a good contributor to your company. In fact, I think you can argue that that can be detrimental. So it's important to have balance. It's important to get out and exercise. I do CrossFit. I don't always enjoy it, but I do it. Um, I don't really have a pet personal project, although I'm getting ready to dive back into iOS game development now.
Mhm.
I've done some iOS development even professionally, and I've dabbled in games specifically, but the capabilities that they keep introducing to things like Sprite Kit and Gameplay Kit, they're so enticing to just be able to pick up. And I think the iPhone and iOS ecosystem is a really great thing to have available. And I've got a son who's 15 going on 16 and considering a career in computer science. And I tell him that he's got everything that he needs to sit down and figure out how to do this and how to get good at it in a way that, yes, he could monetize if he wanted to, but that's secondary or even tertiary. The ability to sit down, type something into the computer, run it on a simulator or run it on your device and see what effect it has. It's a very powerful way to learn. In fact, it's without the iPhone, it's how I learned starting nearly 40 years ago now.
Wow. Yeah, so that's really cool to hear about your personal projects. And with iOS development, does that connect to your current position, or is that just something you're interested in outside of?
Not remotely. I will say that I spent time tinkering with iOS long before I was able to use it professionally, but having tinkered with it, I was able to parlay that into professional experience. When I worked for a consulting group called ThoughtWorks, which is a great company, by the way, and if anybody's interested in it's a consulting model. You work for ThoughtWorks and you get paid by them, but they consult you out to companies. I worked for Bloomberg in New York City and a big auto auction company in Atlanta, and some other small. I worked for Chick-fil-A in Atlanta for a little bit. So it was a neat opportunity to get exposure to several different of their clients. And when they came into the room and said the auto auction company in Atlanta was developing an iOS app to go along with their main web app, and they came in and said, has anybody had experience with this? Can anybody help us out with this project? I was able to raise my hand and jump in. So it was the tinkering with it in private and just for my personal interest that led to that opportunity.
That's really cool. Yeah. So we've got a couple more questions coming in. So here's the next one, and I think you could answer this. Have you ever worked at a startup? And if so, how is working for a startup different from the corporate environment of giants like Amazon?
Well, in some way, about what you would expect, right? It's a much smaller, it's a much more intimate atmosphere. It happens that I've worked for a few things that you could call startups. Some of them were later stage startups. I've worked for one that I joined as employee number one, as technical employee number one. So the leadership was in place. They had the professor at UC San Diego whose idea we were trying to monetize. We had the angel investor who was a super character who's a big deal in the San Diego entrepreneurship arena. His name is Neil Centuria, if you want to look him up. He's a short little Jewish guy and just a hoot and a half. And you can tell by the way I'm talking about it and smiling about it is that I had a great time. We ended up not exiting. That startup got acqui-hired by a company called Viasat, but the team that I worked with was top notch. And even though I didn't make any money off the deal beyond salary, I had options, but they were worth nothing in the acquisition. Even though I didn't get a payout, even though I didn't make $1 million or whatever, I had experience that I would not have gotten I had not gotten to that point in my career at some of the larger corporations, like financial services corporations, or United Airlines was, I spent a lot of time working for airlines the first part of my career. And working for a startup, particularly the pre-money startup, there's just opportunities that you get. And we were using tech that would not have happened at a big brick and mortar type company. So we were using the Clojure programming language, which again, I had tinkered with and kind of led to the opportunity and got to use every day professionally and really get good at it. So I learned from that. As a senior technical employee and as the #1 technical employee, they tended to look to me whenever the CXOs would go visit other CXOs. Yay, Clojure, indeed. I can talk more about that if you guys want. I got to go on these business development trips with financial people and with the president of the company, who were just other guys at that point, right? They weren't people who lived in their penthouses on the top floor and maybe you ran into them in the elevator once a quarter. They were people that I sat next to and worked with, and I learned a lot about the business of running a startup, and they relied on me to be the voice of technical reason when they were sitting, say, with a CTO or with a director of technology, and they got a question that they couldn't field technically. They relied on me to do that. So that was invaluable experience.
Yeah, that's really good. If you're in a startup, then obviously you play a much bigger role, but it's also interesting to hear about the informal culture. So what I'm actually going to have people do is just to kind of make it a bit nicer is if I'm showing one of your questions, feel free to chime in and read it off, right?
Cool.
So the next top question is actually related to what you were just talking about with Clojure.
Mhm.
So
Guess I'm reading. So does Amazon do any development with custom programming languages or other systems in that regard? So Google has Google Go, as well as Dart language that they're working on, Zil with Rust. Apple has Swift, for instance, as well, and other types of systems like that.
To my knowledge, and it's entirely possible, this is a thing I actually like about Amazon. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening in the company that I know about. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening in the company that I don't know about and may never. As far as I know, we're not developing any custom languages, and I think I would know because we'd be using it internally. I think there was some, trying to remember if there was some chat about, no, it wasn't a language. It was, oh shoot, I'm blanking on it. There's some technology that we're basically forking and driving development on the people who own the technology. It's open source, but they also have a business of selling enterprise level features that don't show up in the open source model. Maybe it'll come to me. It might be Elasticsearch. There's a couple of them that I think
Elasticsearch most likely.
Yeah, that we have fingers in those pies, and actually that does ring a bell. So we're driving development on projects like that. There are projects in Amazon. They're few and far between, but there are pockets of rogue Clojure development. There's a large interest in Rust right now, which I think is very interesting and very suitable for the stuff that we do. By and large, services are developed a lot in Java, and some of that is because of the inertia that Java has and the ability to hire for it, which is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Not often is it for the right reasons, which is Java is actually the best tool for the job. It just happens to be the one that people who are working on those services prefer, and that's what they're going to use.
So, and I take it that, using Java and the JVM is kind of what led to Clojure as being seen as an option. Is that right?
It is. So there are pockets of people who, like me, who even if it's not on the approved list right now, for example, when I joined in 2012 the first time, Ruby on Rails was just getting traction for building websites. And it kind of like industry, although I had worked in Rails professionally for a few years by that point, and I started tinkering with it in 2005 in very early days. So at Amazon, it takes a little time for stuff to get traction, and people were building all their websites in Java or, God forbid, Perl. And slowly but surely, there were enough early adopters and tenacious early adopters who brought it in, plugged it into all of the necessary Amazon-specific ecosystem. So we can't just go out to GitHub and pull Joe's favorite project off of a GitHub repo and put it into deployment at Amazon. There's all kinds of risks with that. So there's a lot of security considerations. Even Maven, which is a Java project jar repository and dependency management system, we can't depend on Maven. So we have our own kind of internal shadow of a lot of the things that we find useful that are also in Maven, but we can't get them directly from Maven. What was I talking about? Sorry, I talked myself into a corner there. Good thing it's on tape.
That answers my question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Next question we've got from an anonymous person. So if nobody chimes in, then I'll just read it off. Somebody's asking this question.
Sorry, I have chat up, so it's in the way.
Okay, so whoever asked this question wants to probably remain anonymous, and they're asking, do you use all Amazon services in your daily life? So what I guess that entails is like, do you use Amazon Prime, Alexa, etc.?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've been an Amazon Prime customer for a long time. I don't use my Echo devices as much as my family does. I will turn mine on every once in a while. So it's sitting right next to me, but because I use the word Alexa in so many not asking her questions contexts, I have to have the mute button on constantly. So occasionally I'll ask her to do something. We have devices sprinkled throughout the house, and we'll listen to music occasionally. My son uses it. My son is very much into musical theater, so he'll play show tunes while he's cooking, and that we put them to use, but maybe not as much as you might think. Amazon Prime, we spend a lot of money at Amazon, especially now.
Mm-hmm. So what about internally? I guess it also goes, is my own question, is internally, how much does Amazon depend on services that it creates for itself versus, you know, acqui-hiring or, you know, sourcing out certain parts of a project to third parties? Is most development done in-house with in-house services, or do you use any third-party services heavily?
I think we use, for example, Slack now for our internal communications. Echoes play Despacito. Yes, that is a potential downside. We have tons and tons of internal services that are kind of our bread and butter, especially at AWS, which is really where I work. We mentioned Slack. We bought a thing called Amazon Chime that we actually still use, but was kind of our internal Slack before we adopted Slack. We have our own internal version of GitHub. So we have a Git serving thing that with a nice website and searchability and stuff like that. I would say probably mostly it's all internal stuff, but judiciously we'll reach out, especially where we can get things really secure the way we need them. Trying to solve the problem, but it's down. That happened probably more often than you would think, and it shows up occasionally in the news when it's AWS. So I think AWS had a large Kinesis outage recently, and it played havoc. And also, you hear a lot of jokes about the US East region, the region in the DC area that was the first AWS region and is still by far the most populated. And every once in a while, there's a service at Amazon that will get caught up in some of the weirdness that happens there because it's older and because it's bigger. And because everybody is piling into it, and they'll find out the hard way that maybe they should not have relied so heavily on the IAD region. That happens to us.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about from other people at Amazon that there is kind of this, not necessarily edict, but guiding principle that if you can use an in-house tool, it's generally better. Is that kind of the sentiment that you get working on your teams?
Oh, if only for practical reasons, right?
Mhm.
If I wanted to, say, use GitHub for something, I would have to jump through so many hoops. I would have to get so many security clearances, and I would have to prove to 6 9s that it wouldn't disrupt Amazon's business. So practically speaking, it makes sense to do it that way. But also, we're very much about one of the core principles at Amazon is frugality. And there's an argument to be made for, we could have spent millions of dollars on replicating Slack. And in a sense, we did, kind of, by buying what became Chime and trying to scale it to what we needed. And we ended up going to Slack anyway, right? So there's a point where everybody gets to make the build or buy decision. And it needs to be a real decision. It can't be just based on edict, but it has to be with some sense of, and at Amazon, that means you have to have data. You have to present data that says it makes much more sense to buy this thing rather than to build it.
Makes sense. All right, I'll move on to our next question. Again, another anonymous person, but if you want to ask, go ahead. I'll give you about 10 seconds.
Speak up. Don't be shy.
Yeah.
This is actually my question. I was just wondering, like, I've been told that in my ethics class that this isn't really something that you usually have to do very often, but that it can come up. And I'm just wondering if you've ever had any experience with it.
So the question, currently I am taking a class in engineering ethics. Have you ever witnessed an unethical decision making during a professional experience or felt pressured to go along with an unethical decision? Not really. I've been in situations with personalities who I think I mentioned the toxic experience that I had the first time I joined Amazon. I've never witnessed anybody take a bribe. I've never been presented with a bribe. The closest that I've come to this is I was visiting Seattle one week. I would go for a week at a time when I would travel there, when I was allowed to travel. I'm looking forward to getting back because I think Seattle's a really cool city. And I enjoy getting a chance to see my colleagues in person. We had recently had a refresher on security. And one of the things about security is that, as you can imagine there, we have all these buildings and all of these access control points. So we have gateways and badges that you have to badge into a room or a floor. And the security briefing had made a point of saying that you shouldn't let somebody follow you through a door without also badging themselves in, because that gets recorded and all the reasons you would expect. And I had just watched this video and it happened to me. I tried to go through a door and this guy was clearly going to tailgate me. And I stopped him and asked him to present his badge. I didn't know him. And he got angry. So I just closed the door and let him badge in first and made a point of badging in after him as the door was open. And then I had to chase him down and it turned into a big long thing with security management. And he was a longtime employee and he knew that he wasn't trying to get away with anything. But the point was I didn't. And it did not go well for him. I was irritated, but I was in the right, so it wasn't a problem. That's really the closest I've come. The toxic environment that I keep alluding to, I don't want to name names, but there's a guy who is still at the company who was notorious for doing things like throwing chairs in meetings when he got angry. And in fact, there was a guy on my team whose job it was, he had a real job, but his function primary function in meetings was to keep an eye on this dude and try to de-escalate if it looked like he was going to go into chair throwing mode.
Oh man.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Again, I did not witness this, but I take it on reliable authority that it happened.
Oh, wow. All right. Well, moving on. Another question from Blake regarding open source.
Yeah. So I do a lot of open source work. And so there's frequently things I run into with Google. So Google has Guava for Java and JVM and many other things like that. It doesn't seem Amazon has as much type of open source stuff going on as, the other FANG companies. So what's kind of your perspective on that? I think it's kind of related to your answer of, the security things and making sure that reliability is important and other things like that. But anything more specific?
Yeah, that's a little bit different when it's something that you own, that you make open source or you provide in some open source capacity. The concern for that then, for security specifically, is that you want to be sure that what you export is clean of any identifying information or secrets or something that somebody could use to gain a competitive advantage. So there's a risk reward thing at play there. I believe that Amazon could certainly do better. Using Guava specifically as an example, I'm actually fighting with Guava right now to try to get it to do what I want it to do. And I find it ironic that I'm using this popular Google open source thing that Amazon doesn't have an answer to. So I would like us to do better. I'm a huge fan of open source, by the way. Thank you for your contributions, whatever they are. I had a great experience in my first introduction to open source, and I felt really fortunate that was the case, because there are some projects, Clojure is one of them actually, unfortunately, where they're open from inside out. Right, they'll give you their stuff when they feel like it, but trying to get involved and get something, get a contribution accepted, even if it's what you consider and maybe a bunch of other people consider a useful contribution, it's very hard to do. And ultimately, I decided not worth the effort. I tried for a while to contribute to Clojure and just gave up on it because I was tired of dealing with the personalities involved. My first experience with an open source contribution could not have been different. The dude was very open. He was very grateful. He acknowledged that it was something that his project was lacking. This was a long, long time ago, that his project was lacking. And he acknowledged that the solution that I gave him was complete and it had tests and it worked. And there was absolutely no reason for him not to just deploy it, and he did. So you can have that experience. You can have the experience that I've had with Clojure and everything in between. I think it's a great, first off, a great way to give back. So if you're handy with a hammer and a saw, you can get involved with things like Habitat for Humanity and put those skills to work for the good of people without requiring compensation for it. Open source is kind of our equivalent of that in software engineering. Do more.
To your earlier point, it's kind of like open source in name versus in spirit. So, or kind of the original kind of free software movement with things.
Yeah, and then you get into, well, at least with Clojure, you get into arguments about what is the true spirit of open source. If you're curious, I can point you to some links of conversations that have happened that I don't tend to agree with their conclusions. And like I say, it's easier on my psyche just to wash my hands and walk away.
So kind of building on that, just one last question on the subject. Do you think that there's kind of an issue with some open source projects where that they have that community mindset, but it doesn't really result in clear direction? And that sometimes, like with Python, having kind of a benevolent dictator for life can really help with keeping an overall mission in that regard.
Yeah, they don't anymore unless somebody has actually taken up that mantle, because Guido retired.
No, not Python, not anymore.
Yeah. So the problem with benevolent dictator for life, I can't stand the term, for one thing, because usually the focus is on dictator, right? I think Guido was a very good example of somebody who was not necessarily that way. I think Matt's with Ruby. I forget his full name now. Yukio Matsu. I'd have to look it up now. I feel bad because he's a super decent guy, and I think he's a good example of good open source stewardship. So yes, the problem is not the source or the openness. It's human nature, right? And with any kind of getting together of people, there are power struggles, there's egos involved, there's Python, I think, is an example of a community that the people have had some good experiences with, maybe some bad experiences. If you follow the Scala community, the Scala language, there's all kinds of infighting and outfighting about factions of personality there. Bye, Monica. Thanks for joining. So,
Thanks, Monica.
like anything in human endeavor, there's going to be good people, good people mixed with bad people, a preponderance of good people, a preponderance of bad people, and all I would ask of you is try to be the good people and put up with the bad as best you can.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, David. Okay, next question. We already went over this one, but this one, another anonymous asker, if you want to go ahead, pitch in about. Okay, so David, what kind of work do you enjoy the most, and what are you the best at?
What I tell people is I specialize in being a generalist. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is a lot of people, I think when you answer this question of I get to write Java web apps, right? Or Ruby on Rails, or I might prefer the back end, or I might prefer, Catherine, I'm dying to know what you're having for dinner. What am I best at? So I try not to be best at any one thing. I try to be good at being good at a lot of things. So for example, actually for the last couple of days at work, I've got assignments of things that I should be doing and that I need to do to advance the business goals of the team that I'm on and the organization that I'm in. And what I've spent most of my time doing instead, or in addition, when I can squeeze some of that in, we have a bunch of pipelines with our software that runs our services, and the pipeline takes changes on the left end and deploys them across various stages and tests and does other fun things to them as they go. And they've been blocked for a while now. And so I've spent a lot of my time, I don't see it, but I assume it looks good. I spent a lot of my time fixing that because it's important, because that's an investment that I can make that unblocks a lot of what everybody's doing, not just the stuff that I'm doing. And then I've also spent a fair amount of time in the past few days looking at code reviews, and particularly code reviews from junior developers, and telling them what changes I would like them to make or that I would like them to consider for the future and why. And that's the important part. I don't like just saying, no, you have to do this, no, you have to do that, and leaving it at that. I like explaining to them, here's what makes this a better idea. Here's what's going to make this better software for us to maintain, and more importantly, for the people who come behind us to maintain when we've moved on back to the Alexa org, which I might go into, but I'll go to something different in a few years, I'm sure. And I want the people coming behind me to have a good experience. So I find that very fulfilling. I like the idea of either doing something that is a force multiplier for my entire team or for the organization. And it doesn't matter if that involved writing code. It does matter when it does involve writing code. I like to write good code like the rest of you, but it doesn't have to be just that. And it's more about what's the impact and what's the force multiplier at work, and who got better because of something that I was able to share. It's kind of related to why I'm here tonight.
One thing you mentioned is making sure that when you go back to develop software, and that it's easily understandable for people down the line, once
Yep.
you've finished development. What are some techniques that you use within the company to ensure that software is understandable and easily maintainable throughout its life cycle? That's one of the focuses of this club is you
Mhm.
learn how to do basic coding and your theoretical computer science in classes, but you never truly really build a proper software application that needs to be looked at after the class is over, right?
Right. Yeah. So unfortunately, a lot of that is practice, and that's one of the reasons that I really like that your group exists, is that you get that practice that you don't necessarily get in your classroom. See, Jake. And I would actually argue, so for context for everybody, Varun knows this, but the reason I know about your group is because I'm on the industrial advisory board that sits with the professors and the dean and the group. And there are people from companies here in Gainesville, the people from companies around the region that sit in on, and the purpose of the board is to provide a sounding board for how the department's doing. Because a lot of graduates end up going to work for these companies, and vice versa. These companies recruit from the university and this department specifically because they know the caliber of talent that the department turns out. One of the constant points of discussion is, can you teach your students how to use Git? Can you teach them how to use GitHub? Can you teach them how to do continuous deployment? And I'm actually not one of the people on the board. I can understand why they would value that. I don't think it's appropriate in a lot of cases in a classroom setting, unless the class is good practices for software engineering. If the class is graph theory or neural networks or whatever, you got time to figure that stuff out later. The Git stuff and the deployment pipeline stuff. You need to focus on the academics. You need to, while you're in the classroom, you need to focus on gaining that essential knowledge that, guess what? You're not going to have time to learn on the job. You can learn Git on the job in a couple days. You can learn your company's special pipeline system in a couple days. You'll have to, because you'll need to use it every day for your work. What's valuable about doing some of that now is it's important to understand the benefit of version control. It's important to understand what Git brings to the table, and even compared to what came before it, like Subversion and CVS. Git is an immensely powerful and useful tool, but getting into the weeds of how do I revert, how do I branch, how do I split, how do I do this, how do I bisect, that can wait, right? Get the essence of it, understand that it's important to be able to go back in history. It's important to be able to have some kind of repeatable build. It's important to be able to take a small set of changes that happen to break stuff and roll back to something, to a known good state that is minutes or days back in the past, not weeks or months.
Yeah, and it is kind of trying to balance that, right? Part of the problem ends up being is computer science is not software engineering, right? If your
Couldn't
goal
agree
is
more.
to get a job in a software engineering role, then perhaps there would be a completely different set of classes that would be useful to you outside of the basic data structures and algorithms and discrete structures classes.
Yeah, I've spoken with Varun about that before, where in many places computer science falls under the mathematics department. I do think, especially when it gets things like Git, if there's a software engineering approach, the skills of that and computer science, there's certainly overlap and they're both helpful to each other, but I think they're ultimately different practical applications.
Yeah,
that's exactly the way to look at it, I believe. So we're well aligned there. And I'll tell you, I don't expect our interns, for example, who come either during college or
Not just me, thankfully. Well,
That was my first reaction too, Blake.
yeah.
I think he got disconnected. We'll probably give him a minute or so.
Anyone
Yeah,
else
is it-
having
it's fu-
dinner?
Yeah, I'm having dinner right after this.
Same here.
Yep.
Let me send over an email.
Does anyone want to give me any dinner ideas? I have no idea what I'm going to eat after this.
Food.
What do you
No.
have? Are you cooking or are you like going out to eat?
Something in the house, although I don't know if I have the time to really like cook.
Make a French omelet. That's my go-to. 2 eggs and butter and a salt.
If you're going to be using red, white, and blue food coloring for the French omelet, you may as
That's
well
not
make an
an
American
omelet,
one.
That's just eggs.
Just
It's called a
I
French
mean,
omelet. It's actually a thing, man. Look
Like
it
how
up.
the French fag like doesn't actually have anything, it's just entirely white. That type of French.
Yes.
Okay, David's back.
Oh, there we go.
You're on mute.
welcome back. We were all talking about dinner.
It's an appropriate conversation for this time of night.
Yeah.
I'm ready myself.
Yeah, we used to after meetings we'd generally just all go out and have dinner somewhere on the time.
That's awesome.
On town.
I actually have a somewhat dinner related question. Is there any sort of like a practice, ritual, whatever, at Amazon regarding food? Because that seems to come up with pretty much every software team that I've been on here at campus. Everything revolves around food.
There is certainly a lot of food at Amazon. In fact, there's a what's the user group name there for each floor in the building, one of the buildings that I was in at least. There was a floor 10 vultures email list where if somebody had a meeting where they brought food in and there was food left over, they would bring it to the kitchen area and email the vultures group. And frequently they didn't even need to because people would discover it on their own. Amazon is very interesting and unique in my experience that teams are it's really still, even at the scale that we're at now, the company is run as a bunch of cooperating autonomous teams. There is still no serious attempt from top management to impose a management style from the top down. If you're getting your work done, you're meeting your targets, you're adding benefit to the company, even if you're throwing chairs and people know about it, if it's working, you can do it.
Wild.
So teams have the point of that was the teams come up with their own rituals and activities. And fortunately, all of the teams that I've been on, save that one, are with people I like and who actively like and want to take care of each other. So there is a vibrant social life at the company outside of just the office.
When you say the teams work independently, like is that getting very siloed, or is there still a fair bit of communication between the independent teams?
There is necessarily communication, but it is possible to get siloed, or it's possible to isolate yourself to the point of I guarantee you there are teams that are doing the same work that other teams are. And sometimes that's a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing, because what that does is it gives you a chance for competition in the evolution sense. So sometimes two teams or multiple teams finding that they're doing the same thing, if they happen to communicate and learn that, that turns into another team that does that thing for all the other teams who are doing their own version. That's kind of what my team does right now with centralized authorization. Everybody was rolling their own authorization stuff just for the stuff they cared about. And enough teams did that, the leadership looked at that and said, we need a team that will centralize this function. So it leads to a lot of evolution.
Great to hear about the company culture, David. So next question we've got from Monica, who it doesn't look like we've got Monica in the meeting still, but if that's somebody in here want to
Yeah,
read
she
off
said
their-
you had to leave for work or something like
Oh,
that.
right.
Yeah, I'll take
Okay.
it anyway.
Yep.
So what sort of activities could a university student participate in to leverage their chances of joining the software dev internship team? What would the job entail? So interns at Amazon actually get projects, and sometimes overly ambitious projects, unfortunately, but they tend to rise to the occasion. So maybe I should just stay out of that conversation. I've heard ideas floated for projects that I thought, really, that's going to be a lot. But in a sense, it gives people a chance to shine. And on the teams that I've been on, the teams are very good about supporting their interns. As far as activities to participate in, write code, pay attention to the stuff you're learning in this group, because it is valuable, even if it's not something that you get reinforced in your classroom. But also, one of the things I encourage people to do wherever is whatever tool you're going to be using, get good at it. Don't just pick Java and slap some Java code together. If you're going to use Java, commit to Java. If you're going to use Python, write Python in Python, not Java in Python. Do contribute to open source. Figure out ways to write code in a context. Don't use JavaScript. JavaScript, believe it or not, is very heavily used, and necessarily so. And again, if you find out that you're going to use, sorry, Blake, if you find out that you're going to use it, you may as well get good at it. And there's actually a book called JavaScript: The Good Parts. O'Reilly publishes a series of books called something, The Good Parts. And I point out to people all the time that one of their JavaScript books is like this. JavaScript: The Good Parts is like this. But there's a lot of very cool things you can do with JavaScript. And in fact, if anybody wants a pointer to some really good resources on very cool use of JavaScript, hit me up and I will send you a link that I think you'll enjoy.
Absolutely.
It's not all as bad as a lot of the bad code in the internet makes it out to be.
Yeah, we like to hate on JavaScript sometimes, but that's mainly because of the type system. You can't really figure out.
Not as much as
Absolutely.
MATLAB.
Oh, it's a foot gun, to be
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, and another amusing thing. So JavaScript is kind of an accident of history, right? Because Java came up, and I was doing Java from early days in Java, and it just makes me giggle every time somebody talks these days. You'll read things, people saying completely seriously, I wrote something in, I don't know, some language, but I had to drop down to Java for performance reasons. And that was unthinkable in 1995. Performance in Java was a joke in 1995. And yet there's legitimate reasons for people to do that now. And it actually, the JVM, more so than Java, right? The JVM as a technology that has grown in an evolutionary way with the needs of the internet and the popularity of Java. JavaScript, I think, has a lot of the same opportunities. There's an implementation, it's sad but true, Java equals low-level programming now. There's an implementation of closure in JavaScript, and JavaScript is a favorite target of higher level languages, precisely because of the reach it has, because it's available on every browser.
I've actually been using or learning to use JavaScript properly for my non-software development related internship at Infotech, which, in case you didn't notice, Blake's background is an Infotech background because he did the software development internship there. But I'm learning how to develop a Chrome extension because we go to websites and need to access some data off of them later. So I'm trying to make one that can just grab that data and save it off for you.
Yep.
Make it all nicely formatted.
Good. If you're going to do it well. Be aware of the pitfalls and avoid them as best you can.
So we are coming up on time. We'll probably take one or two more questions, David, depending on your schedule.
I'm good. I'm hungry now, thanks to Catherine, but I can make it another few minutes, I think.
Yeah. So we'll do one last question. I think this is pretty solid. You know, you're obviously a Gator alum. What has your career path been, and how did your time at UF shape or influence it? And I guess I'll add my own little spice on this. What is important for us to focus on now as university students? You know, earlier you said there are some things you can learn on the job and other things that you really can't.
Yeah. What has my career pathway been like? Winding, and some of that is related to my comment about being a generalist. I started right out of college, graduated in '87. In June of '88, I started my first job with the airline industry, the computer reservation system. It was Eastern Airlines, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was down in Miami. And I almost didn't take the job because they made me take a test just to interview. And I had just gotten my degree and I was so done with taking tests. Not only did I have to take a test to do the interview, which I almost bailed on for that reason, but I did it anyway. And then I found out at the interview that when you work for an airline, you get travel benefits. So it was totally worth it. I flew to Hawaii for $50 each way. And I think I got business class one way. Flight benefits are really cool. But the first thing I did at that job, I started in June of '88, and I sat in a classroom for 3 months, learning the language and learning their tools and learning how to do what they did. I was getting paid for it, so I didn't mind it as much, but it was sitting in a classroom. From there, I mentioned Java. I started Java in 1995, got my first job, I think, in '96, and then bounced around on a couple things. By 2000, I was doing Java again. By 2005, I was doing Ruby. And in 2010 is when I joined the startup. 2011 is late 2011, 2012 is when I went to Amazon. I've done a couple things since then. So I've been all over the place and I've worked in financial services. Oh, this is of interest to an SEC audience. I worked at Louisiana State University and learned COBOL. I don't recommend either, but I've done it. Actually, Louisiana State University itself was pretty cool, except for the fact that they hate gators. So of course I built my shrine of all my UF paraphernalia in my cube. The campus is beautiful. Baton Rouge is kind of a hole, but the campus is really nice. How did my time at UF shape or influence it? Honestly, I was not a good student in undergrad, and I just kind of schlepped my way through my degree. So one of the things that you can do is not do that, right? Focus, apply yourselves. I learned how to do that late, but for a long time I did not. I spent more time in the music building across the street from Marston because I was singing with the university choir and chamber singers and the opera workshop, whatever it was called back then, and doing everything I could to avoid doing the actual work I needed to do for my academics. So it's a wonder I got my degree. I did a lot better when 20 years later, I went back for my master's degree and had more experience and more maturity and really applied myself. And frankly, that is the thing that's really shaped the last 10 years of my career, because I got my master's degree in 2008. And it's massively increased my pay. I'm not saying that this is causal, but it's definitely correlated. I got a significant pay raise soon after completing my master's degree, and it's opened doors that would not have been open for me either with just a bachelor's degree or with the attitude that I took to my career. So have fun and do fun things and enjoy your time in college, because it's, even going back 20 years later for your master's degree, it's not the same experience. Living in a college town when you're a grown-up like I am now, living in Gainesville, it's not the same. So make the most of your college years, but apply yourselves at least part of the time.
Great advice. So I guess we've come up on time and everybody's hungry for dinner. But David, thank you so much for reaching out to me and getting this set up with me. Very valuable session, I think, for a lot of the people who are, considering going for an internship or job at Amazon, or just generally want some pointers as far as, what they can improve on and what is important to focus on. I also like that we had a couple more kind of technical and open source questions from Blake that you provided your input on. So with that,
Well, as you may have noticed, I'm not at least short on opinions on things. And by the way, I'm happy. Reach out to me. I've already reviewed a couple resumes for people for Showcase, and this is the reason I got involved with the IAB, not so I could sit in a room with those people, but so that I could gain access to you all who are where I was 30 plus years ago and don't know what I know now. So if I can help you by sharing the benefit of my experience, I'm happy to do that.
All right, then. Well, thank you so much, David. I'll go ahead and stop recording.
All right. Thanks, everybody.